Regina também, tá? Vou
Pessoal,
falar para ela.
We're going to start right now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for being late. We had some technical issues we had to solve in the last minute, but of course, we are going to make sure that we're going to hold a great event. I'm very happy, I'm delighted that we're going to open the second program on feminist economics that is promoted by the Center of Research of the University of Science Economics of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, by the Institute of Fiscal Justice, and by Latinidad, that is the Network for Justice, Economic Justice from Argentina. I'd like to greet everybody, my colleagues, Maria de Lurdes, that is the director of the University of Economics, Veronica Serafini, that is the coordinator. She's an economist and also feminist and researcher of Latinidad. And also, I'd like to greet our coordinator of feminist economics, Daniela. She won't be present today's event, but she's going to show us a video. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome ladies and gentlemen that accepted our invitation to be part of this program, not only, but to share your knowledge, experiences, expertise, because we're all doing this collective learning. We're thinking, analyzing, and proposing new things. These people, I'd like to thank you especially for those who are being part of this meeting, and also thank the professors that accepted our invitation, that for free, it's important to mention that are giving their time and their efforts for this program today. So I'm going to give the floor to Maria de Lourdes Cunha. She's the director of the University of Economic Science. So she's going to start talking to us. Maria, you have the floor. Hello, Maria Regina. I'd like to greet everybody from today. Veronica Serafini, Mieke, Meurs, and everybody that is present here today. I'm very happy. I'm delighted to be part of today's second event on this area, on this segment. I'm very happy to participate. I was also here in 2019. It was a great satisfaction. It was amazing because of the energy, the power, the participation of everybody, and by the many words that were shared of all the participants of the event in 2019. As Maria Regina has said, I'm the professor Maria de Lourdes. I'm the director of the Economic Science University. It's one of the 29 units in Rio Grande do Sul that was chosen for 8 years as one of the best universities in the country. We're ranking second, but we would like to rank first in the years to come. But we are amongst the first places both in Brazil and also outside Brazil, in which we participate of this ranking. And this is very important. We are very proud that our university, is like our surname, and we have that all the time with us. We can be part of this university, but this university is always inside of us. This program that was promoted by this faculty, this university, by the research that we started in the feminist economics, it was able to expand the center and bring in people that are engaged in this struggle to strive for new spaces for women in the labor market, also in our homes, in all the potentialities that we have and that we clearly have of many great women that had this struggle before us. We are here to move forward, to go into the future, inviting other researchers, other women that are able and open to discuss, to strive for new spaces for our students, for women, for our families, and all women that come after us, that are in this moment together with us. We are very proud for everybody, for all women that are part of today's women that are participating on this University of Economics. And it's amazing to have so many people that are engaged in today's event. As Maria Regina has said, that are offering their time for free on behalf of this movement of social and feminist economics. So I wish you a great event, and this is one more successful event that is also only the second, but of many others that we will hold in the future. It's really a privilege to be part of today's event. Thank you, Maria de Lurdes, for your kind words. Before giving the floor to Veronica, I'd like to apologize. I haven't greeted the Professor Mieke Meurs in the beginning. I just said hi to those who are here at the table, but I would like to welcome afterwards. You're going to be able to talk better when you give your presentation. I really apologize for not mentioning your name before. So Maria de Lourdes has said, we are doing this collective work. There are many, many people, many partnerships. Actually, we started since March. The dates that we celebrate about women, and we worked together with Latinidad, an event on feminist economics that Veronica has also participated, and then we made contacts. So we could have a program in Brazil on feminist economics, because Latinidad had already held this kind of program. I'd like to give the floor to Veronica so you can greet everybody and start with the first words. It's amazing how you're helping us to foster this event, inequality of a person that is representing the Institute of Fiscal Justice. I'd like to add on that, on the reason why that we are having more and more interested today. I am the president of this institute. We are very interested, as you said, Veronica, to learn more about gender, why the inequality and also the taxation has to do with inequalities. If we live in a country that is so unequal as Brazil, with such wealth concentration, why and how these inequalities should be part of all the sectors. Otherwise, we have to change our taxation system, our tax system. We have to understand that the tax system is not neutral. We have inequalities in all the sectors, and also the gender inequality that we have in relation to the tax system in Brazil. This subject is very important for us from the Institute of Fiscal Justice. If we think about Brazil, the Brazilian project, we have to take into consideration theories such as the feminist economics. What does it say? Because it's no longer possible to think about a country that is not connected to the economics, that doesn't consider all these areas in the life of as the center of everything. That's the reason why we can no longer put that aside. So the Institute, despite we work especially with the tax and fiscal system, we can no longer separate in the 21st century gender issues, the care, social care in terms of race and classes, and also the gender inequality isolatedly. That's the reason why we are making this effort with everybody from Latinidad, also with the groups of feminist economics that I met in the first edition of the program. As Maria de Lurdes was saying before, I was part of the first program. It was a presential program. We held this program every Friday night, and we observed this collective effort of women that were interested in promote these theories, especially feminist economics. And after that, I was more and more interested in this theme. And that's the reason why we're holding this program. I'd like to ask Roger, if it's possible, that the Professor Mieke can start her presentation. I think that is today's highlight, this lecture that is going to present to us very soon. And if we could now present her and also show the video of the Professor Daniela Kuhn, she's the coordinator of the Center of Feminist Economics. If it's possible, we're going to wait for the video because Dani could not be here today. Professor Maria de Lurdes will have to leave us soon, but we know we have many different agendas. That's life, but we have to do the best of it. So we have the video of the Professor Daniela Kuhn. We're going to show it right now.
Boa noite, pessoal. É com muita alegria, com muita satisfação que eu dou a todos.
I'd like to welcome everybody. I welcome our second program
de economia, curso de extensão em economia feminista.
Of this course on feminist economics. We are looking to the new perspective of what is happening in the Latin America, promoted by the Center of Research on Feminist Economics, promoted by the University of Rio Grande do Sul. I'm the coordinator currently.
Mas, obviamente, isso não é um trabalho que se faz sozinha e talvez, como já mencionei, em outros espaços, a grande virtude nesse caso específico tenha sido não atrapalhar.
I'm trying to support the organization of this beautiful event, of all the sets of lectures that enable us to
a partir de hoje, né,
after today,
às segundas-feiras à noite, então das 19 às 21
from
horas,
7 to 9 o'clock, we are going to be dealing with this theme of feminist economics. We are going to hold these meetings. We're going to have 3 meetings. The last day is going to be held on November 29th, and then we're going to have a very important time to discuss different themes that are part of this feminist economics. I hope that everybody has the possibility to stay with us. We have this first class today, and the final class that is going to be streamed by this program. Next week, then, we will have the classes in this environment of the virtual classes. I also would like to let you know that in this moment of remote teaching and because of agenda, I'm not with you online today, right now, in this very moment. I'm just sending this video. Maybe it's kind of boring. I will try to just say a few words, and also I'd like to convey a message for you. The studies on feminist economics, they're part of a struggle and the proposal of feminist economics that were conducted by the professor. She is retired, but she's very active in the center. She's going to be with us, and she's one of the major persons, one of the most important persons to promote this program. She's fundamental of the first program, and she's still working very hard in the second program. It's important that we acknowledge that you know to some extent how the second program has expanded. We are trying to look for some network and promote a program that will be broader than the one that we held before. I think it was 2 years ago. Lots of people were part of that program. I think it was on Friday. It took place on Friday nights and also on Saturdays. We had lots of people that were very interested in this program. They were very active, even with the pandemic, in the virtual environment, promoting what we were doing, both in the organization and this, what I call extension program. Those that are part of this program, Ana Carolina, maybe she got in touch with you in the second program. I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank Maria Regina from the Institute of Fiscal Justice. She was engaged
do NECOFEM de uma maneira bastante definitiva,
promovendo
as discussões, permitindo a organização de parcerias,
and also having new partnerships. Also, Cristina Vancelli, she is a doctor today in economics by the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. And at that time, when they started thinking about the center, she was always engaged, always helping.
Inclusive com a sua tese, né, que vai tratar questões macroeconômicas.
She's going to deal with macroeconomics issues, and also about work, and also feminine work with her professional performance. And she was part of this course that was fundamental to establish partnerships
entrar em contato com as nossas colegas, pesquisadoras,
our colleagues, researchers that are part of today's event. I'd like to thank Andrea as well,
que é técnica da UFRGS,
that is a technician from the university that was helping the organization. Thank everybody from Silva in this partnership for the streaming that made it possible that we were here together, organized, striving for the best streaming from the channel of UFRGS, both in the current direction as well as the previous one.
Fundamentais no apoio e no processo de acolhimento desse lucro, né? Acolhimento da temática,
of this theme, and also fostering this theme that has led us the possibility to be here
muito bem
together,
acolhidos institucionalmente dentro da Faculdade de Ciências Econômicas. Então agradeço também a parceria da FCE, que se desdobra aí no trabalho das colegas, que envolve também o CIVAD, do ponto de vista dessa operacionalização, né, do processo como um todo. Nessa edição, a partir dessa rede que vai se construindo,
this network that we built together
da economia
around
feminista, nós contamos com
theme
um
of
apoio
feminist
muito
economics.
importante
We
da
count
Latinidad,
on the
que
support of
está aqui
Latinidad.
conosco hoje,
She
né,
is here with
que é a
us.
rede
That is
latino-americana
this
por
Latin
justiça
American network
econômica e social. Então tem um
social
trabalho
justice
muito importante de difusão
and also
e de debate em
tax
relação a
system.
essas
We were
temáticas.
discussing
E
this
foi
theme
também um
and
incentivador
also
importante para que
was
esse
helping
trabalho,
us.
que esse
So this
debate ocorresse
debate,
de
this
uma forma mais
discussion took
sistematizada,
place in a
com uma
more
rede mais ampla de
systematized
participantes,
manner, a broader way
que
as well,
possibilitasse abarcar esse debate
so we
por
could
toda a América Latina,
expand
né?
this
E isso foi
discussion in Latin America.
fundamental para
for us.
nós. Nós tivemos aí
We
alguns outros
had
momentos de
other
parceria,
moments of
e essa
partnership,
troca tem sido
and
muito importante.
exchanging all this information has been great. I thank you very much for your
na pessoa
availability
da Maria Regina,
on
como da
behalf
professora
of Maria
Verônica.
Regina and also
Quero
on
também
behalf of
agradecer a presença da
Professor
professora
Veronica. I'd
Mieke.
like
A
to thank the
American
presence
University tem
of
sido
the
uma
Professor Mieke
parceira há
Meurs.
bastante
American University
tempo
has been
nesses
our
estudos,
partnership in these
inclusive
studies
nos dando a
for many years,
oportunidade,
offering
a
us
mim,
the opportunity
quanto a Cristina, né, de interagir
to
com os
interact
estudantes, de
with
conhecer
your students,
realidades
to know the
que envolvem as
reality
temáticas
that
de
is
gênero e da
part
economia
of this
feminista
gender
ao
theme
redor do
on
mundo,
the
né? Várias
feminist economics
experiências têm sido
around the
muito
world.
ricas e
All
ela
these
hoje então
experiences,
conseguiu
they are very
estar
rich
conosco
and great that
conversando
she
um
was
pouco
able
mais
to be
nessa
found
nossa
today
grande
with
aula
us, and she will
inaugural, que é uma
talk
aula
to us in the
importante, que é um momento
first
de
class.
alegria,
It's
que
a great
culmina
moment. We're very happy.
a organização do esforço então
And
das meninas
all this
para que
joint
esse
effort
curso
made this
existisse e
program
começasse.
possible,
Tá?
and
Quero
that we can
agradecer
start
também.
today. Also like
Então, a
to
Maria
thank
Regina
Professor Maria
traz
Regina,
essa
Paiva,
interface
this
com a Latinidad,
interface
mas
with
também nos
Latinidad,
coloca em contato com o
that
Instituto de
put
Justiça
us in
Fiscal,
touch
que também é
with the
parceiro
Institute of Fiscal
nesse
Justice,
evento,
that is
nesse
also a
curso,
partner
e que
in this
estará
program.
conosco aí
She
ao
will be
longo
with us
dessas aulas
along
e
these classes,
da discussão
and
das
also the
temáticas que nós
discussion
temos aí para
that
fazer
we
até
will
novembro. Então,
held
sem mais
up to
delongas, eu queria
November.
mais uma vez
So, I'd like
apresentar e agradecer aos
introduce
nossos
and
parceiros
thank our
que
partners
viabilizaram esse
that
momento.
made this moment
Quero também
possible.
agradecer ao interesse e à presença
And
de
your
cada
interest,
cada uma de
your
vocês,
presence here
e que nós
today,
possamos ter
so we
aí ao longo desse
can, along
período,
this
um
time,
ambiente
to
profícuo, um
have a very
ambiente
fruitful
importante, um ambiente de
event
consolidação
of
desses debates,
consolidation
um
of the
ambiente de consolidação
discussion
das
and
parcerias,
also the
da formação das
partnerships,
redes.
the
Vocês
graduation,
verão
the
que
formation
houve uma
of the
preocupação
networks. We
e
were
uma
very
busca
concerned
por um conjunto de
for a
temáticas
set
que
of
não são as
themes,
únicas, né? É claro que essa é uma temática que vem se
because we know
ampliando e que
that
vem
this is a
abrindo
theme
um
that is
leque
very
importante
important,
de
opening
espaços de
new
pesquisa,
spaces for the
espaços de pensar
research,
essa
spaces
existência
to
da
think
mulher
the
no mundo e da
existence of
condição
women
de
in the
mulher e as
world
suas
and the
consequências.
condition of being a
Então,
woman.
nós temos muitos temas a
we
tratar,
have
nós
lots of
fizemos alguma
themes to
escolha,
deal with.
mas foi uma
We
escolha que
made
foi feita com muito
choices,
carinho,
but
foi uma
we
escolha que foi
made it very
feita
carefully.
pensando
We
essas
thought about
interações,
the
inclusive do ponto de vista
interactions
regional, né? Vocês
in our
verão que nós
region,
temos
and in
palestrantes
other
e
places we have
participantes
lecturers,
de diversos lugares do
participants
país e da
of
América
many
Latina.
places
E
of
isso
Brazil, of Latin
está
America,
sendo muito
and
importante para
this
que a
is
gente
very
pense
important
ao fim desse curso, ao fim dessas trocas, né, desses estudos, tanto a possibilidade de um conjunto de pesquisas que eventualmente a gente possa fazer junto dentro dessa rede, mas que a gente possa, assim, configurar, né, uma rede que troque informações, que sistematize a produção desse conhecimento e que possa divulgar entre pares e a comunidade em geral a importância desse olhar que precisa ser dado essa área do conhecimento, que é a área das ciências econômicas, pensar esse olhar, então, da economia feminista, seus desdobramentos e suas consequências. Eu desejo a todos e todas um ótimo curso, uma ótima noite, uma ótima palestra, e que nós possamos nos encontrar ainda muitas outras vezes para tratar daquilo que, ao fim e ao cabo, pode ser pensar um mundo melhor. Muito obrigada.
World. Thank you very much. So that's an introduction that we believe it's very important to introduce the program, introduce the people that are helping, all the entities, all the institutions, the organization of this event. I'm going to start explaining to you that in 2019, the university has made a partnership with the American University to develop programs on gender in the graduation level and also for post-graduation. That Professor Kuhn, they participate. This program has training, participation in seminars, and also exchange of experience for the development of new programs, the inclusion of the agenda of feminist economics in programs that are already consolidated. Professor Mieke is the coordinator of the Center of Analysis of Gender of the Science Economics University of the American University, and she's the mentor of the program. In addition to that, she's also a professor and associate dean of graduate studies. She recently taught heterodox microeconomics, political economy, and she has a program on complex programs. And her research and publications are mainly in the area of feminist economics, care work, and gender. So, Professor, you have the floor. I'm very happy to welcome you. We're very anxious to listen to you and also to let you know that you're going to talk in the first part, and then we're going to have time for questions, and then the second part of your presentation. Is that it?
That's right. Can you hear me okay?
You have the floor. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers and to the Open Society Foundation, who has been helping us support our program. And also thank you to everyone who's shown such great interest in this topic. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. So I wanted to start by talking about giving a kind of general introduction to feminist economics, thinking about the question of what are we building? Next slide, please. So we can think about why and when did we start to do gender analysis in economics. So really, in the 1970s, analysts and policymakers who were working in the area of economic development began to focus on women, who had up until that time been more or less invisible in economics and in development. So we saw the United Nations Decade for Women from 1976 to 1985, the Fourth International Conference on Women in 1995, and the current push, which really continues but varies by context, to achieve gender equity. This is connected to other sustainable development goals, like achieving empowering all women and girls, ending poverty in all of its forms everywhere, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all at all ages, promoting employment and decent work for all, and reducing inequality within and among countries. So all of these sustainable development goals are clearly linked to gender equity. Then, of course, we have the current context of COVID, which has given a lot of attention to the issue of care work that women do, often invisibly. And recently, there's also been a lot of attention to the importance of understanding care work and unpaid work and the relationship between paid and unpaid work for macroeconomic models. And understanding that if our macroeconomic models do not include analysis of unpaid work, then the predictions of the macroeconomic models are likely to be inaccurate. So there's a lot of attention now on gender analysis within the field of economics. Next slide, please. So why should we consider gender analysis in economics from a feminist approach? So economics, of course, is an excellent analytical framework for understanding individual behaviors, including choices that lead to aggregate economic outcomes. And we have empirical approaches in economics which allow us to measure patterns and relationships between variables and over time. So economics is an excellent framework in general, but we have the problem that the representative agents in economic models ignore important differences between men and women. And not just in their behavior, but also in the way that economic structures affect men and women differently. Importantly also, traditional economic models really don't include any attention to the reproductive aspects of households, which, as we will come to understand, is not automatic or free labor. Next slide, please. So what we have seen is that women, when they increasingly enter the economics profession, they begin to bring a distinct perspective to economic analysis. And because of their distinct perspective, they propose new approaches. So perhaps most importantly, women have argued that well-being of humans and adequate standards of living should be the central objective of economic policies, as opposed to the typical economic emphasis on efficiency. Women have also highlighted the importance of unpaid care work, both for well-being and for the functioning of the market economy. Women have brought a concern for inequality in the distribution of resources and power. Women have brought attention to the intersection of different types of disadvantage. And women have challenged the assumptions such as self-interest and exogenous preference formation, which have been really fundamental to economics. So as women have entered economics, they have pushed to change the way we do economics. Next slide, please. But I don't know if any of you recognize this person here. This is Elinor Ostrom. She's the first female winner of the Nobel Prize in economics. And her work actually was not specifically on gender, but she has argued that gender economics is important not just because of its focus on gender, but because gender economics will produce good economics, good science, and good econometrics. So Julie Nelson, a feminist economist, has written in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that many readers may have discovered that they already do feminist economics in some ways, although they may have preferred to think of themselves as just doing good economics. So our argument is that studying feminist economics is not just important for understanding gender issues, it's important for improving the science of economics itself. Next slide, please. So today I'd like to spend a little time talking about what I see as the building blocks of feminist economics. So I'm going to list 5 points here, and then I'm going to explore them each in a little bit more detail. So a first fundamental building block of feminist economics is the idea that the reproduction of households is fundamental to economic life, right? We have to go home, we have to have our clothes cleaned, and we have to have food, and we have to have a good, comfortable place to sleep so that we can go back out tomorrow and make more production. But Shahra Razavi of UN Women has argued, I think very importantly, that this kind of work, which tends to be sort of invisible in economics, is not automatic. it has to be done, and it has costs. And so this particular function in economics needs to be a central focus for economic analysis. A second building block is the understanding that the economy and society are characterized by structural inequalities between men and women. A third building block is that these inequalities are fundamental to how we understand household decision-making, which, as you might recall from your economic studies, is a really important part of overall economic analysis. A fourth point is that reproductive work and structural inequalities have an important impact on productive outcomes. So that even if you're not interested in gender, you should be interested in feminist economics in order to better understand how production works. And finally, as I mentioned before, an important building block of feminist economics is to understand that the goal of economic analysis and economic policy should be the well-being of people, and importantly, in this day and age, also the planet. Next slide, please. So let's pick apart these building blocks a little bit more. Let's think first about the issue of reproduction. So if you take a traditional economic textbook and you think about how it describes households, households are best understood as consumers. They may be single individuals, or they may be a group of consumers taking a joint decision about consumption. They might be families, but their ultimate aim is to satisfy the wants of their members with their limited budget. Households are the owners of factors of production for this theory. They own labor, they own capital, they own land, and they have entrepreneurial abilities. And they sell these services of their factors, and they receive income in return in the form of rent, wages, interest, and profit. And that's the only thing we need to know about households in traditional economic analysis. Next slide, please. So here we see the typical diagram from an introductory textbook, which sort of sums up what we need to understand about about households. So what we see here is households are engaged in exchanges with firms. They exchange their factors of production, and they receive goods and services. So feminist economists ask here, what's missing? So what this model ignores is how labor, a factor of production, actually gets produced, how the costs of producing labor are distributed among members of the household. Of course, this theory also ignores all the important things that happen inside firms, but that would be a topic for a different lecture. Next slide, please. So here is one feminist economist, Maria Floro's, attempt to redraw that model that we see in the traditional textbooks. And this is a kind of complicated picture, but what I want to point out to you in the picture is all the places that we see unpaid work and care work appearing, right? So we see that in the household sector at the bottom of the screen, there is both paid work. You might hire someone to do some work in your household, but there's also unpaid work, care work, domestic chores, subsistence production. And that unpaid work in households tends to be completely left out of economic models. But unpaid work doesn't only occur in the household. In the government sector and in the business sector, there's also various kinds of unpaid work. Some of this work is what we've come to understand as emotional labor, right? So when a female employee maybe takes on the role of making sure that people who are upset in a meeting calm down, they get back to liking each other, or make sure that new employees become comfortable members of the team. And of course, we might have the same kinds of unpaid work being done in the nonprofit sector. So throughout the whole economy, there are different types of unpaid and informal work, which are often done by women, which need to be included in our analysis of how the economy works if we are to be able to make better predictions about the economy. Next slide, please. So then, to sum up, feminist economics is a paradigm that redefines the economic sphere of inquiry from a market exchange to a concept, a much broader concept, of the provisioning of human life. It emphasizes those things that human beings need in order to survive and flourish, such as food and healthcare, and their production through market work, but also through activities such as unpaid work in the home, volunteer work in the community, and social organizations. Feminist analysis aims at presenting alternative visions of economic processes and using these visions to transform social and economic life so as to reduce gender, race, and class inequalities, as some of our introductory speakers were mentioning, and to promote the expansion of people's capabilities. So whereas mainstream economics thinks of itself as a positive science without any normative objectives, feminist economics embraces an identity of a normative science seeking to achieve well-being of all people. Next slide, please. So in doing feminist economics, one important principle is to avoid what is sometimes called the add women and stir approaches, in which you simply do mainstream economics, but you might add some attention to the fact that women have different labor market outcomes than men, or you might add a dummy variable for female-headed households in your regression. So the most obvious way of introducing gender into economic analysis is to do those kinds of things, to simply disaggregate some variables by sex. But this approach does not put into question the basic analytical approach of mainstream economics, of assuming that somehow household production just gets done in a free kind of way, of valuing only market work, and of focusing on market exchange rather than human outcomes. So a second, better approach would involve identifying missing variables that are of particular importance for gender and bringing them into the model. So if we look at differences in women's and men's labor force participation, we might bring in the issue of childcare into the analysis. But a third and even better approach is to conceptualize the economy as a gendered structure. That is, to understand gender relations as an intervening variable in all economic activities. And so when we analyze a particular problem, we try to analyze all elements, factors, variables in the problem through a gendered lens. Next slide, please. So that's thinking about reproduction. Now let's think about the building block of feminist economics, that is structural inequalities. So this diagram, I think, is sort of interesting. It shows us a variety of different structures: markets, informal institutions, households, formal institutions. And those are all different structures. And so we want to think of all of them as being gendered in different ways. And then we see that with the little wheels here, that those then impact on kind of standard economic analytical categories like agency, endowments, and opportunities. Next slide, please. So just giving some evidence about these different gendered structures in market economies. So one issue is markets. Some people argue that markets are gender-neutral institutions. Anybody can participate in the marketplace. But of course, feminist economists have emphasized the way that the structures that men and women bring to the marketplace put them in very different positions with respect to market opportunities. So here's simply some data on land rights of women in different countries. So access to land may be very different for men and women. In some countries, women may have access to land only through their husbands, or they might have use rights to land, but not titles. So when they go to the marketplace, for example, to borrow some money, they might not have the same access to collateral as men. They might not be able to get the same access to different kinds of inputs as men. And they may simply not have as good quality of land as men. And so clearly the market itself may appear gender neutral, but through a gendered lens, we see that men and women will be able to use these markets in very unequal ways. Next slide, please. This is just a second example here, focused more specifically on financial markets. So a question was asked in a survey by the OECD whether an individual felt that they would be likely to be able to get the money they needed to start a business. And so here we see the diamonds represent the share of men who said that they would be able to get access to the needed money through the marketplace, and the blue bars represent the women. And so you see that in many countries across the world, really every country, I think with one exception, women have less access to finance in marketplaces than men do. Next slide, please. Another structure, which was sort of depicted in the diagram that we saw, was social norms. So social norms may again affect men and women differently. I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but here's some data simply asking men across the world whether they would prefer that their women stay home and not seek paid employment. And here you see that across the globe, there are still many men who think that it would be better if their wives stayed home and provided unpaid work to them than engaged in the paid labor force to earn income. So social norms affect men and women differently. Next slide, please. So I think this is particularly interesting. The structures which affect men and women differently affect some things which are as basic as food. So what we see here is results of a global survey asking, looking at households in which, looking at households and checking the weight of women. So on the horizontal axis, we have the percentage of women who are underweight in the economy, in the whole economy. And on the vertical axis, we have the percentage of underweight women who are found in the poorest households. And what we see here is that in countries where a greater share of women are underweight, okay, so more toward the right-hand side of the diagram, it's the case that a lower percentage of those women live in poor households. Okay? So more of the underweight women live in households which are not poor. So this is just evidence that the distribution of resources within a household is not equal, right? Even of something as basic and essential as food. So households are another structure where we see inequalities. Next slide, please. So these inequalities within households is one of the reasons why a third building block of feminist economics has been to look very closely at models of household decision-making. So until feminist economics came along, what we see here was the standard model of understanding how households make decisions. So households were seen as a unitary decision maker, one unit, and they made the decision as a unit. And so we just have the mathematical depiction of this below, right? And there was no interest in how that decision might get made inside the household. Next slide, please. But feminist economists took on this model, looking for empirical evidence to see whether it seemed likely that that's how households made decisions. If households decide as a single unit how to maximize their total benefits, then the decisions of the household should not be affected by the distribution within the household. The household makes a decision and it uses its resources to achieve that maximum, no matter who brought the resources into the household. But there's very interesting empirical evidence that this is not the case, and really zero empirical evidence that it is the case. So a couple of well-known examples in the literature are a scheme in South Africa where pensions were paid to either women, grandmothers, or men, grandfathers, in households. And then the study looked at how are the pensions used. And they found that if you give the women the money to the grandmothers, the money is used to improve child health in the household. But if you give the money to the grandfathers, the money is not used in that way. So that suggests that the decisions about how to spend the money are not made by the household as a single unit, but different individuals in the household have different ideas about how the money should be spent. A second example is an interesting paper about dairy farmer households in northern Kenya, and these households are nomadic, so they move their herds around. So if men and women are choosing to maximize the utility of the household, you would expect the husbands who decide where to put the cattle to choose the places where they would produce the most milk and the most income for the household. In these households, however, women sell the milk and women control the use of the income from the milk. And what the study found was that men tended to prefer to locate their cattle farther from the towns where income could be earned. Because in fact, they preferred that their wives not have too much income, which gave them more independence. So these two and many other studies suggest that households don't make decisions about how to use their resources as a unit. Next slide, please. And if we assume that they do, then this may lead to policy failures. If we give the money for certain kinds of policy to the household head, but the household head does not make the decisions on how to use the money by cooperating with other members of the household, then the money may not be spent on the things that we expected it to be spent for. And if we focus on this unitary decision-making model, then we ignore policies which would do things like change women's access to property, to credit, to public works, to legal and institutional rights, which might more effectively improve the outcomes that the policymakers are seeking to develop. Next slide, please. So feminist economists have worked on developing a different model of household decision-making, a model of decision-making which understands that inside the household there may be different interests and that we need to look carefully at what the different preferences are and how men and women differ in their ability to express their preferences. And only by understanding these dynamics can we understand how to best achieve our policy goals, who we should give the resources to, how households are likely to use resources they're given, and so on. Next slide, please. Feminist economists have thought that in order to understand how decisions are made within the household, we need to understand how these specific elements that you see here on the screen are distributed differently between men and women. We think that people's decision-making, men's and women's decision-making, is influenced by things like their potential income or earnings, who owns the assets in the household, who has better social networks, what's their productivity in household production, and what are their preferences. So all of these different, very specific dynamics between men and women and distributions of assets between men and women are going to affect how decision-making gets done. So in order to figure out if we give the money to this individual, how will it be spent, we need to dig very deeply into the structures, the inequalities within the household. And that kind of detailed analysis will allow us to make better policy decisions. Next slide, please. A third building block of feminist economics is to understand and insist that reproductive work and structural inequalities have important impacts on productive outcomes. Obviously, the economy cannot operate at its full potential to meet the needs of its population if half of its population is facing significant structural obstacles. Next slide, please. So here's just one example. This is from a study of African farmers And the study examined how the productivity levels on plots of farmland that were owned and managed by men compared to women. So they found that men and the production on men's plots tended to be about 28% on average in Malawi, higher than the production on female plots. So the researchers examined this in more detail and found that the productivity difference between men and women had to do with differences, structural differences, in men's and women's access to things like land, credit, and high-quality inputs. So female farmers could be much more productive, 28% more productive in Malawi, if they had better access to those inputs. And you see the other differences in the other countries are a little bit less, but still very significant. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a similar paper on Latin American countries. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide in this presentation. Oh, maybe there's one more section. I guess we'll see in a minute. It may be the final slide in this presentation, but I think this slide is very interesting. It's a kind of aggregate look at the losses that we experience from these structural inequalities. So this is also from the OECD, and they've tried to estimate the costs of gender inequality, right? And so you see here that in Latin America, the estimate from 2016 was that there were $658 billion worth of losses in productivity because of these structural inequalities between men and women. And then in OECD countries, there was about a $6 billion loss, and you see the other gaps across the region. Are there any more slides in this presentation, Christina?
No, there is not.
Okay, great. So we could have some discussion or questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was amazing, a great speech. You gave us this scenario, global scenario of the vision and also the feminist economics. It was very important because it shows that there are lots of evidences and situations in which we see the differences that are not those classic and conventionals or mainstream, as we have already discussed before, that the economics decisions, the irrational, because of that person, because of a white man as a rational subject, the most conventional models that we have somehow of economists is up to now. There is a certain restriction, I would say. Maybe also it stops or doesn't go forward when a person says that she is a feminist economist. According to the setting that the person is, she or her or his acceptance is not the same, and it's different from what we have. And when we think about the vision of the classic economists, but the manner that you talk about it, it is very important. And I'd like to use this time to ask you something that I bear in mind when you said about the difference that it still exists, is because there is a big difference between men and women. Our situation is, in terms of gender inequality, is very big. I'd like to ask you, please, in this moment, why we haven't evolved as much, and why are we still giving the first step despite the feminist economics being in place for more than 70 years? Why do we still find this resistance, why we still have so many problems. What would be the situation? Why do we still have people that separate these points? Why people don't take account this feminist theories? Because I think they are very good. They are very adequate that we think about this century that we are living in now. So this would be the first analysis. Why is it so difficult when the theme is feminist economics, in your opinion, of course?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I agree. It's very frustrating after so much time and effort and work, right, on all of our parts to see that we're still climbing a big hill. You know, what are the reasons? I think one reason is that it has been very hard to break down the kind of walls around mainstream economic theory, right? So one of the projects that we're working on with the colleagues at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul and other universities worldwide is to build more programs for teaching feminist economics in universities. And we know that this sometimes is very difficult. You know, some of our colleagues in economics departments say, oh, but that's not economics, right? That's sociology or something else. And so we have this problem kind of legitimacy, I think of. And I think we work very hard on this. You know, we have very excellent economists who are feminists, who have excellent training from top institutions. We have a journal of feminist economics, which has very high standards of review for publication and which was very highly ranked. We have an international organization, the International Association of Feminist Economists, you know, which allows us to exchange information and science right across all of the countries. And still, you know, we have trouble getting the recognition that we need. So I think a very important step is the things that we're doing right now and that I hope all of you will do, you know, after this seminar, of taking things back to your department and talking, you know, convincing, showing that we have these important insights to bring and that there is real science behind this, right? And evidence and data and models, and that these things need to be taken into account, and that if we take these things into account, we produce, as Elinor Ostrom said, better economics. But it's very hard to do. And there's a lot of gender, as you all know, in all of the international institutions, you know, every office in the World Bank, every office in the ILO. And I don't want to disparage the good work that they do. But in many of those cases, it's a very limited kind of gender analysis. It's very much on the level of add women and stir, right? Or maybe bring in a few additional variables that are particular to women. And I still feel like there's a lot of resistance to digging into the kind of social detail that we need to understand how these structures of inequality are reproduced day after day in every household, in every, you know, market exchange, in every firm and business and employment situation across the globe. And it's just, I think it's a lot of people don't want to hear it. It's complicated and difficult and unpleasant to change how you do things, especially if you are someone who has to give up power to do that. So it's a battle, as I'm sure many or all of us recognize. So that's why it's so great that everyone's here today to engage. Other questions?
Very important, Professor. Thank you very much. I recalled about the political participation in Brazil. Brazil has very bad participation in the feminine participation in Brazil. It's very bad. Our rates are very low. We have to see how we're going to have laws, better systems. If we have this political representation, that's where we're going to materialize better political representation, which is very low. we have to move forward in this point. But we also have a very specific question for you that was asked in the chat about the studies on productivity that you have presented. We also talked about reproductive representation. There is a calculation of productivity per area. Is the question clear? Well, if there are more products for people or only one product, or the productivity per area?
I'm not sure I understood the question exactly, but the studies are done. These studies actually mostly have been funded by the World Bank. They're done very carefully, so they try to compare the control for the quality of the land. They measure the inputs very carefully, and they measure the outputs very carefully. So if the question is about the quality of the measurement, I would say that I think the quality of the measurement is very good. It's not that there are always productivity gaps, and in some countries the productivity gaps may be smaller, but in general, what we find is that because women have less access to financial resources and more domestic reproduction duties that they have to attend to, which take up time, both of those contribute to their having lower productivity on their plots than men do on average. And so it kind of focuses that attention on trying to get women more equal access to credit, to purchased inputs, and so on, and also to get them fewer reproductive duties so that they can spend more time on their plots doing the things we know are important, like weeding and fertilizing and so on. So the studies sometimes have contributed to policies which provide piped water to a community, so women don't have to spend so much time collecting water and they can spend more time weeding, things like that.
Thank you very much. Explain the question. There are some questions here we cannot answer because of time constraints. Maybe if there is a question that we have later on, we can send it to you. You can answer it afterwards. Of course.
I'm happy to do that.
Well, I'm sure we can count on you answering the questions afterwards. Well, we have a situation in Brazil that is very peculiar, very different. And there is a question in the chat: how do we evaluate this question that most households in Brazil, they are poor, but they are headed by women? We have a very number of households that the person that has, an income, is the head of the family, is the woman. And at the same time, I have one more question for you that has a relation. What is evaluation? What is your assessment regarding the women that don't have a husband, for example, because they decide to be the mother by themselves without a husband? They don't have access to form organizations of work. How can we change this system, this paradigm? And then we can go to the second part of your presentation so we can, observe the time.
Okay. So, right, that's right. And this issue of female-headed households is very important. And one of the problematic add women and stir approaches to analysis is to compare female-headed households with male-headed households, right? And then to consider that gender analysis. So this is very problematic because women in female-headed households have, in some way, they have a lot of power, right? They're the decision maker. They control the income, as you've said, and so on. But at the same time, those female-headed households tend to face many structural inequalities, right? So they tend to be poor because they don't have a male head, and the female head has to be the one who tries to get credit in the marketplace, right? Who tries to do paid work and unpaid work at the same time, and so on. So if we want to understand gender dynamics, looking at female-headed households is not the whole story, right? Because we have to look inside couple households as well in order to understand gender dynamics. But when we look at female-headed households, we need to really look at those in the context of those structural differences. And your point about choice and choosing to be a female-headed household is very important, right? Why should it be the case that if you have a female head instead of a male head, you're consigned to poverty? It's because of the structures and the structural inequalities. So if we can break down these structural inequalities and make sure that women who are single-headed households don't have such a terrible reproductive burden and have better access to things like credit market and employment, then being female-headed household, which may be a perfectly good choice in terms of having power and decision-making authority, will not necessarily result in your being also poor. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. So we should move on now, is that right, to the next presentation? And what time would you like me to be sure to stop by? Is there a time I should have in mind?
Please, yes.
Okay. All right, so thank you. So the next part of my talk is to think about doing teaching and research in feminist economics. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about some data sources that are available to us as teachers and researchers in feminist economics, and to talk a little bit about having an impact. And if we get short on time and you'd like me to stop, please just let me know. Next slide, please. So my first point is that not having enough evidence or data is absolutely no excuse for not teaching about feminist economics or doing feminist economic analysis. There is extensive data now, which is very easily available on gender statistics. So first, let's think about what are gender statistics. So there are two kinds of gender statistics that have been developed since the 1970s. So the first, and the one that came first historically, was gender disaggregated statistics. So for example, labor force participation, unemployment rates, rates of land ownership, rates of access to credit markets could be disaggregated into men and women to help us understand some of the differences between men and women, some of the structural differences in their ability to access markets, and so on. But we also now have some statistics which were collected specifically to understand and address gender issues. So for example, for many countries, you can find access on household decision-making. So there are kind of standard set of questions which ask, in your household, who makes the decision about child health care? Who makes decisions about your health care? Who makes decisions about large household purchases, and so on? So that's an example of data which was collected specifically to understand a gender issue. There's also some surveys which collect gender disaggregated household information on who controls assets, who decides whether assets should be sold. And there are questions about, say, contraceptive use and decisions about using contraceptive, decisions about how many children to have, and so on. So all of that fits into the second category of easily available data on gender issues, which is specifically collected to understand gender dynamics. Next slide, please. So these data are useful for multiple purposes in teaching and in research. So you can identify and then figure out how to address gender gaps. You can track progress in sustainable development goals. You can make more effective policy for social change if you use these data. And you can measure the outcomes of your policies. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just identify a few examples of some of this data for you. This is not anywhere near a comprehensive list, and I just encourage the use of Google, because you can Google just about anything these days and find a data set which will provide you data on important gender questions. So let's look at some examples. Next slide, please. So the UN Human Development Report, for example, has a gender development index and also publishes data on the components which go into that index. And so here is the link. Next slide, please. So in Zoom, you can't go easily from the link to the website and come back to your Zoom site. So I've just provided a screenshot here. So this is from the UN Human Development Indicators website, and this is some data from Brazil. Okay, I just picked an example. So here you can see some interesting gender data, the share of employment in non-agricultural jobs for women, the share of seats held by women in local government, the youth unemployment rate, the ratio of female to male, just as some examples, just to inspire you to go to their website. Next slide, please. Another good data source is the United Nations, which has a minimum set of gender indicators. And the United Nations has developed these specifically for measuring progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. So the indicators all pertain to the Sustainable Development Goals. So here's the link, and next slide, please. So here are a couple of screenshots from this website. This first one is interesting because it gives you some of the data that you might need to measure progress on specific Sustainable Development Goals, listing the development goal here on the table. And then you can see a little bit over farther to the right, it tells you which international organization provides this data. So if you want to go and find more data, you can go, for example, to the International Labor Organization or the World Bank or the Food and Agriculture Organization as listed here and find the data on their websites. Next slide, please. But the UN website on Sustainable Development Goal indicators also provides a lot of data immediately there. So here I'm just showing you a screenshot of the main page for the minimum set of gender indicators. And here you see that you can find quantitative indicators, but you can also find qualitative indicators. So not simply, survey questions, but also more interview questions, focus groups, and so on. You can find it by country, right? And you can download it. So these two tables I printed out, or I copied for you, are just two examples of the quantitative indicators. These are for Brazil. Oh, and so here on the left-hand side of the screen, it shows you that you can select by country, right? And so here I've picked Brazil to just show this example. Next slide, please. So this kind of country-level data, which I should say other great places to look are the World Bank, which has something called World Bank Data, www.worldbankdata.org, I believe. And the OECD also has really fabulous data. So this country-level data can help us to do some very basic things. We can compare average values by gender, men versus women, to understand the gender gaps across a whole important range of things, from labor market things, fertility, contraception, household dynamics, access to marketplaces, and so on. This kind of data also lets you look at trends over time and to watch for aggregate policy impact. So if you know that a certain law changed in 1 year, then you can look at the data over time and see whether the policy has had the impacts that we expected. And you can compare countries which have different policies to see how they might be doing on different kinds of outcomes. This data is great for teaching. You can send your students to the website. You can make up a little exercise, find the time use data and find out whether women in Brazil spend more or less time on unpaid work compared to women in Peru, for example, right? You can send them to these websites and give them little exercises. It's really fun. The students really like getting involved with the data, and it's very easy to access. If you spend just an hour, you don't have to spend your whole life setting up the exercises. You'll be able quickly to find something. Next slide, please. But of course, this data has a lot of limitations because it's aggregate data. So you can't disaggregate this data for specific questions. If the website doesn't provide comparisons between rural and urban, or by level of educational attainment, or by age, or wealth, or marital status, or number of children, then you just can't answer that question. And you can't use this data to explain relationships between an outcome, say employment, and other factors like age or wealth to analyze policy targets, because you just have the individual separate variables. Next slide, please. So for those of you interested in doing some research on your own, where you'd want to be analyzing questions of your own, then you're going to want the micro individual level survey data. And so here, it really depends on what country you're in. So there are labor force surveys for every country. The ILO makes sure that countries do these. But whether you can access your labor force survey really depends on the country. In some countries, you can just go to the National Statistical Office website. Like in Mongolia, for example, they have a law which makes access to data totally free and open to the public. The argument is your tax dollars paid to collect this data, the data is yours. And you can just go to the website, you can click on the labor force survey, and you can download the anonymous individual level data and do analysis. But in other countries, you may have to ask the National Statistical Office if you could get permission as a researcher to use the data. But these micro-level survey data are very useful. They're very common because the international organizations like the ILO work with countries to make sure the data gets collected. And so there is a massive amount of national level survey data that can be used in every country. And a little bit of Googling and talking to policymakers, local economists, and other people will help you find this survey data. Next slide, please. So if you use these large data sets, you have a huge advantage. First of all, they have a large N. So if your analysis is going to be statistically significant and more useful, therefore, to policymakers. They're nationally representative. So again, the conclusions are more relevant. And of course, if they're large N and nationally representative, if you are looking for publications of your research, it will be easier to do that with these large data sets. They cover a really wide range of issues, as I said, from household decision-making to health issues, to labor market issues, to unpaid work and care work. And you can use them to answer your own questions. And as I said, some of these are free and easy to access, but others are going to require a little more work on your part. Next slide, please. So my last point I want to make before we open this up to a little bit more discussion is that, remember, I want to really encourage everybody to remember this, that the goal of economics, of feminist economics, is to, next slide, change the world. So, next slide, please. We want to make sure that our research or our teaching makes its way out of the ivory tower. I don't know if you use this expression in Latin America, but in the United States, we sometimes refer to the university as the ivory tower. And we want to make sure that our research gets out of that tower and into the hands of those people on the right who are the policymakers and voters and advocacy groups that we need to influence. Next slide, please. So when teaching and doing research, I want to just encourage everybody to think about how you can use this to motivate the voters or the future voters in your country and the policymakers. Next slide, please. So you need to think then strategically. Who could use your skills that you're developing in gender analysis and feminist economics? Who could use the data that you have downloaded and come to understand really well? Who could use the analysis that you're doing of those micro-level survey data sets? Is it government officials, government administrators? Is it nonprofits, NGOs in your country, businesses? And I didn't put this on the list, but voters is another really important category of people that you might be wanting to provide your skills, data, and analysis to. Next slide. So after you figure out who might be able to use this important work that you're doing, then you have to figure out how can you reach them. So academic publications are great, and they're very important for many of us for keeping our jobs, but they're not the most effective way to reach policymakers and voters. So as feminist economists, we need to be thinking about what else can we do. So could we organize a public event like this one, where we could reach researchers or people from NGOs or public policy people, government leaders? Could we have a blog where we share the data we've been collecting on gender inequality or the analysis we're doing, or even just our thoughts? What about our Twitter account? Do we have one? Maybe we should get one as a feminist economist so that we could influence people. And what could we share that would be important that we specifically have in terms of our skills, our data, our analysis? Do we know any journalists or other people in the media, reporters, who we could collaborate with, who might be interested in sharing the data we found or the research we're doing or the things we're teaching in our class? Data visualization is really important. You know, many voters, they hear statistics and they can't grasp them. So one thing we can do as scholars and academics and economists is to find a way to make the data into a clear, appealing, easy to understand picture so that we can share our data with a much broader audience beyond the academic community. And maybe we could even think about making a video which we could share on our Twitter or on our blog that might influence people who, again, are not going to be looking at our tables or interested in any regressions. Next slide, please. So through our work with the Open Society Foundation and lots of people like you around the globe, we've developed some projects sharing research that I just wanted to talk a little bit about that I think are nice examples of having impact. So one comes from a study of unpaid work in Uzbekistan. So it's a collection of time use data, and some researchers had analyzed the time use data, and they had shown, as time use data does show, a very unequal burden between men and women in paid and unpaid care work. So the researchers and some activist journalists had a goal of creating greater public awareness, just of this terrible inequality inside households, which affects women's labor force outcomes. And the goal was particularly to focus on young couples. The thinking was that young couples might more easily adjust their behavior inside the household. They might be more open to these kinds of messages and so on. So there was a collaboration between a group of young journalists and the researchers who had been doing this research on unpaid work. And they made a super creative video, which I watched with some narration because, of course, I don't speak the local language. It showed, a young couple, they come home from work, they've both been working, they're tired, and, he sits down to read the newspaper, and she starts chopping things in the kitchen and is rushing and stressed. And, the video just kind of doesn't preach, it doesn't say how you should understand this, but it just shows these things and it raises some questions for the viewer to think about as they go along. And I think it's a really great example of taking interesting academic scholarly work in feminist economics on an important question that really affects the well-being of women and men, actually, because it affects their relationship with their partner and their relationship with their children if they don't participate in unpaid work. And really try to figure out a way to change the behavior and the understanding, awareness of voters, just basic people in the population. Right? So the policy impact is to affect public opinion, to affect voters, and hopefully to change behavior in some households. Okay, next slide, please. So a second example has to do with care work, and this is an example from Colombia from some partners we're working with at Javeriana University in Colombia. So the research that was being done there was some research on COVID, and the research was showing a really severe impact on the households of domestic workers in Colombia during COVID. So the employers didn't want the domestic workers to come to work because they were afraid that they would bring COVID into the household. And so the domestic workers were without employment very suddenly, and obviously these are workers that don't have a lot of savings, and we're in a very difficult situation. So there was some economic analysis among feminist economists looking at the impact of this on the domestic workers. But then it was the case that local governments in the communities where the domestic workers live were also very interested in helping the domestic workers because that's their local population. And they wanted to figure out how to help them get through this time. And this is an important public policy question because after the crisis is over, people are going to want that care provision back. So we have to reproduce the workers during the crisis period so that they can continue working after the crisis. So the problem was that the local government and the organizations that work with domestic workers didn't have skills to analyze the data, and they didn't have the information, didn't know how to find the information that they needed to analyze the problem. So the researchers worked with the local organizations to create a web page which became a kind of library for local governments and advocacy groups and worker organizations where they could find survey data which would show the impact on domestic workers, where there was actually Stata code which empowered local governments to do some of the analysis themselves. And then the researchers from Javeriana University, the feminist economists, also worked with the local governments to collect some additional data that wasn't available in surveys on the impact on domestic workers and what their specific policy needs were during this period. And also the Javeriana researchers provided training to local government officials on how to do the analysis using the Stata data, but also how to collect data properly so that the analytical results would be useful and correct. So they created this kind of web page combined with training and support for collection of additional data. And the policy impact was to create awareness and evidence of local problems of the women workers, and to give the local government, the affected workers, and their advocates information that was needed to influence policy debates. Next slide, please. So just kind of to wrap this up, we want to use all that data that's available to us now, and we want to try to get that into the hands of our students, and we want to use it for our own research, and then we want to make sure that that work that gets done by us and by our students gets into the hands of the people who can use it to solve important public policy questions. So how can we really be effective? First, of course, we want to start by choosing our research and teaching topics, choosing those that have significant policy relevance in our particular context, because our students are all different and our countries or communities are different, and so there's no one correct set of topics. Then we want to reach out early in our research to organizations that are working on this topic or with these affected populations, and find out from those organizations what kinds of data or analytical needs do they have? What kind of evidence do they think they need to provide to the government or to local voters or to their local population? What are the problems that they need analyzed? And where are the places that we as feminist economists can cooperate with these people on the ground to provide them with, well, to empower them, let's say. So we want to, that's really the purpose, I think. As feminists, of course, we don't want just to change the way we do analysis, we also want to empower people. So we want to be able to show, voters, show local organizations, show advocacy groups, show workers' organizations where to find the data, try to provide them with a guide on how to use that data, maybe do some training. And also, as teachers and instructors in the university, we want to train researchers that they can employ, right? And that's really the goal of our developing these graduate courses in feminist economics, is to train more researchers who can be employed by governments and advocacy groups and worker organizations to ensure that these policies get improved. So you want to use your findings to provide relevant information to affected groups and their organizations. And I want to emphasize this last point, and not just say it quickly and in closing. It's really important to use creative methods if you want to effectively build public and public policymaker awareness of issues, right? We have to get beyond writing papers, and we all have to get out of our comfort zone and use social media, use the media, use websites, collaborate, Twitter, right? Find ways to reach people wherever they are. Are there any more slides? Okay, so wrap up. So build your skills and those of your students. Bring your own voice to key policy conversations. And I want to emphasize this point too in closing. You know, there's a lot of discussion these days about decolonizing economics. And I think this is a really important point. Economics, as we were saying earlier, is a field in which there are very big walls around economics. And there are very strict rules about how you can do it, what you can study, what methodologies you can use. And I want to encourage everybody to break down those walls. So if you think the analysis should be done in a different way, if you think the questions should be different questions, if you think the data we need to bring to the questions is different from what's being done now, develop your own voice and bring those things to the table. Because one thing feminist economics has really tried to do is to argue that we need to do things differently. So let that argument empower you to do things differently. And then finally, don't stay in your tower, but get out there and change the world. Okay, that's it. Questions, comments? Uh-oh.
Thank you very much. It's very important that our ideas, they come through, they become project, also lines of investigation and research, that we have good data source to have the foundation to make it stronger, to have better analysis. I think that we all understand that the feminist economics has to deal with these practical aspects. Otherwise, it wouldn't be good if they are not presented, if they're not promoted, if they're not put into practice. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I would like to ask you, please, and thank you, especially thank the translators that have helped us in this today's event to make it possible and to make it very profitable, both those of Libras or sign languages and also languages. I'd like especially thank them. I just have one last question for you because we are at the end of today's meeting, taking this time, and also because of your great speech. First question for you. Do you think that the feminist economics is a cross, or it goes beyond boundaries, or can it, I mean, has other subjects involved, or is the feminist economics is only one field of subject, or do we have other possibilities? What can we expect on the feminist economics after the pandemic? Do you think we can already think after the pandemic, or do you think we are still in the middle of it? What would be our alternatives in terms of feminist economics in this period after the pandemic? Thank you very much for your participation. For me, it was amazing, and please for your last remarks.
Thanks so much. Yes, that's a great question. So first of all, your point about is there just one feminist economics is a great point, which I had actually intended but did not make earlier, which is that feminist economics is many different approaches, right? And so I have tried to focus on the building blocks, places where people tend to agree generally, but there are many different ways of doing feminist economics. Some people do very rigorous, complicated, cutting-edge regression analysis, very standard kind of economic analysis, but with a feminist grounding, right, in more context and so on. But others reject using regression analysis and do qualitative work. We work closely with sociologists or anthropologists, collect their data in different ways. And so that's very important, that feminist economics is something that opens economics, tries to break down those narrow walls which say, no, only this is economics, and say anything which helps us understand how social life is provisioned and how we promote the well-being of humans can be economics. That those are the fundamental questions. Bring any tools to the table to understand them. So that's a very important point. And on the post-COVID thing, I mean, sadly, clearly, globally, we are not post-COVID. In the United States, we had one tiny moment of about 2 weeks where we thought we were post-COVID, and then we realized that we were wrong. So, but I think that you're linking that to feminist economics is very important. It's been a time when many, let me say, men who in the morning used to go away to work and not think about what happened in the household have been spending their whole day in the household, watching and participating in unpaid work. And that is changing how men see unpaid work. It is changing how unpaid work is done in the households. And we have seen that even when women go back to work, when workplaces reopen, the dynamics in the households have changed permanently. And so I think we will see that that affects both how we do economics, a little bit at least, and how we think about economic policy over the long run. But how much, that's something we'll have to wait and see. So I'm sorry we ran out of time. I'll just reiterate that I'm happy to engage online if people want to send questions, or even if there's some kind of group chat that you want to start for the class, I'm happy to participate.
Fantastic. Well, it was excellent. Your participation was very inspiring. I think that this is one of our objectives, to show the feminist economics forward, so it becomes a tool for people, mainly women, that we are, trying to reach them, maybe a tool to think more, and that is very useful for our lives. And so we can look for a better world, because that's what we always strive for. Being feminist or not, we all want to have a better world. But I'm sure that the feminist economics is moving towards this direction of having a more humane and fairer world. So we are going to resume the program next. Monday, it was just an opening class with your brilliant presentation. Next class, next Monday, we will hold again another meeting. If you want to ask more questions, she can answer. We can send the questions to her, and then we can have your questions answered here. I'd like to thank again our interpreters, those of CISAD that are here today, those who are in the backstage. I'd like to thank you very, very much, and see you next week on Monday. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.